Chapter 1. Echoes in the Void. OPS-3, do you read? OPS-3, do you read? The crackle of the radio jolted me. I launched myself across the module, a clumsy ballet in zero gravity, and snatched the receiver. My hand trembled as I brought the mouthpiece to my lips. I wiped a film of sweat from my forehead, the station's recycled air already feeling too close. Receiving, I managed, my voice raspy. A lump, cold and hard as a golf ball, had lodged itself in my throat. A brief pause, then, "It's good to hear your voice, comrade, Zudov." His voice, usually a comfort, now seemed to echo from an impossible distance. "You too. How are things on your end?" I leaned towards the porthole, pressing my face against the cool glass. Out there, the void was a tapestry of indifferent, twinkling stars. I searched for a glimpse of the Soyuz capsule, a pinprick of hope in the overwhelming black. All systems nominal. The view of the Pacific is breathtaking. A beat of silence. "Have you managed to reach ground control yet?" I asked, the question heavy with unspoken fears. "Comms are still down. Solar flares, I expect, should clear up in a couple of hours." "I hope so." The lump in my throat seemed to swell, pressing against my windpipe. I swallowed hard, trying to make room for the words. "It gets lonely up here. On my own. Only 7 days to go now, Boris. You can last that long. I'll see you then." "I can't wait. Talk to you soon." I replaced the mouthpiece, the click echoing in the sudden silence. I turned back to the porthole, my gaze drawn to the divine curve of Earth's glowing horizon. 7 days. An eternity. Without flight engineer Zholobov, the Salyut 5 station was a hollow shell. 100 cubic meters of beeping radios, flashing lights, and the occasional jarring blare of an alarm. But beneath these thin distractions, a profound silence pulsed, an ever-present suffocating threat. I knew that soon enough I would tune out all the familiar noises, and the silence would consume me, pulling me down into a state of clutching, reticent dread. A sigh escaped me, heavy and uncomfortable. I was suddenly, acutely aware of my own solitude. I tore myself from the porthole, the Earth's beauty now a mocking reminder of what I'd left behind. Pulling myself through the stale air, I headed for the living area. The sliding door to the cramped toilet compartment was half open. It squealed in protest as I pushed it shut, the sudden noise making me cringe. A half-hearted chuckle spilled from my lips, a force of habit. There was no one else on the station to hear it. My appetite had vanished days ago. The generic meat paste in the food storage cupboard held no appeal. Truth be told, I hadn't eaten more than a packet of dried apricots, a couple of crackers, and some of that spread in the last 48 hours. If ground control knew, they'd have me on the next Soyuz heading for re-entry in the blink of an eye. If I hadn't been out of contact with them, I might have even considered telling them, just to get off this floating tomb. With no desire for food, I decided to call it a day. It was a simple matter of flicking off the main cabin lights, crawling into the restraints of my sleeping compartment and praying that the station wouldn't fall apart while I slept, praying that the silence wouldn't finally swallow me whole. Chapter 2. The Fever Dream Warm. Uncomfortably warm. The fabric of the sleeping bag clung to my skin, slick with a sweat that wasn't entirely from exertion. I fumbled with the zip, my fingers slipping on the cold metal. The air in the capsule felt thick, like tar, and I swam through it with a weary lethargy. The thermometer, glowing with its insistent green digits, displayed 19.8 degrees Celsius. Exactly as it had the day before, and the day before that. "That's gotta be a mistake," I muttered, tapping the screen. As if a physical prod could somehow reset reality. It just left a sticky fingerprint on the glass. Either way, I needed a shower. The thought of the cool water was a distant comfort. I used the back of my forearm to wipe my forehead, sighing. This could wait. It was probably just another sensor problem. Another gremlin in the system I wasn't qualified to fix. This whole station felt like it was perpetually one fault away from depressurizing, from spiraling back down to earth, as brittle as a feather, in a storm. The violent hiss of the shower was a welcome shock, the cold pressure sluicing away some of my deep-rooted misgivings. I couldn't focus on my anxieties while I briskly rubbed my skin raw with the harsh soap bar. Once clean, and feeling marginally more human, I turned the knob. The last bubbles of water floated gently from the nozzle, shimmering in the dim light. With the sound of rushing water gone, the station's subtle symphony returned. And with it something else. A muffled voice. Shit. I banged my head on the shower cubicle roof, a dull thud, as I scrambled to spin myself around and climb out. It left, a stinging mark on the gray plastic. Not wanting to miss whoever was on the radio, I ignored the pain, pulling myself naked and dripping across the space station, toweling myself haphazardly as I went. OPS-3, do you read? OPS-3, do you read? Zudov again, receiving Soyuz 21. I gasped into the mouthpiece, still breathless. I'd almost given up on you, Boris. Sorry, I was showering. Well, I'm glad I reached you. I was beginning to think we were the only souls up here, comrade. At least you're not alone on the Soyuz. I'm all by myself here on Salyut. Ha! You are lucky, my friend. Flight engineer Rojdestvensky is starting to drive me crazy. Only 6 more days to go, I reminded him. More for my own benefit than his. For you, maybe. I have my whole mission to complete. I managed a sympathetic chuckle. I truly did sympathize with Commander Zudov, ever since my partner, flight engineer Zolobov, had secured his ticket home by accidentally chopping off 3 of his fingers in the airlock door. Zudov had been my lifeline. He had kept my spirits up. He had kept me working. He had kept me hopeful. Zudov was a great man. He'd be hailed as a hero back on Earth when his mission was finished, I was sure of it. How are you doing anyway, he asked. It's warm, I said, the words tumbling out. It's too warm up here. I don't understand how it can be so hot inside, yet so cold just out there. I gestured vaguely towards the porthole. Hot? Zudov's voice sharpened, instantly alert. What's your thermometer reading, Boris? 19.8, as always. It's probably just a sensor problem, don't worry. Boris, it's fine, Commander, honestly. I'm only slightly too hot. A couple of degrees, maybe. A lie. It felt like a furnace. Well, you radio me straight away if it gets any hotter. Understood? Don't worry. He would worry, though. I could hear it in his voice, a faint tremor beneath the usual calm. Well then, I must leave you. See you soon, my friend. 6 days to go, I confirmed, before clipping the mouthpiece back into its cradle. The silence rushed back in, heavier this time and filled with an unnerving, cloying heat. Chapter 3. Phantoms of the Past. The rest of the day was a constant losing battle against the oppressive heat. Communication with the ground remained stubbornly silent, the solar flares apparently still raging. So I attempted to remedy the problem myself. That started with the simple task of running diagnostic programs on the central computer. After it flatly denied any problems whatsoever, I hit a brick wall. My mind churned, dredging up fragmented memories of endless technical documents, of cosmonaut manuals filled with black diagrams and minute labels. In the stifling heat, they all seemed to melt and twist into impossible shapes, non-Euclidean planes that boggled my already strained mind. I couldn't think in the straight, logical lines required for a task like this. In the heat, everything spun, spiraled in and out, a focus in my mind's eye. Concentration, it was safe to say, was a luxury I could no longer afford. Instead, my thoughts drifted, unbidden, to Zholobov's last day on the station. In my feverish flashback, it was hotter than I remembered it being in reality. Zholobov's brow glistened with sweat as he climbed down, extending his massive frame out of the tiny airlock. He gave a relieved gasp, glad to finally move his limbs without them slamming against the walls. I watched him from my seat by the main control console, my eyes aching from hours spent staring at the monochrome screen. I called out something to him. I was not in control of my own actions or speech in this memory. Whatever it was, muted, and overshadowed by what came next, it made him turn. As he did, he placed one hand on the metal rim of the airlock to steady himself. Jolobov replied with a chuckle, his words equally indistinct. His lips were blurred in my recollection. Indeed, the entire man's outline was slightly fuzzy, the lack of clarity most noticeable around his face. He was now just an out-of-focus photograph in the dark recesses of my cortex. We finished our brief exchange. Jolobov reached up for the handle on the hatch. He turned back to face me, just as he pulled, bringing down the sharp, unforgiving blade of metal. It dropped onto his other fingers with a sickening thump. The jarring blow shook me from my recollection, jerking my head upright. I gasped for air, my head instinctively turning to the scene of the accident. A small, dark smear, undeniably. Blood still stained the side of the hatch. Had the noise of metal hitting metal still echoing in my ears been real? Or was it just part of the memory? In my heat-addled state, it was impossible to tell. The thermometer still read 19.8 degrees Celsius. I shook myself, trying to dispel the odd stupor. Hundreds of tiny sweat droplets detached from my skin, floating lazily across the cabin. The armpits of my flight suit were damp, as was the fabric down my back and crotch. The temperature must be rising. Thump. There it was again. Despite the suffocating heat, the sound sent an icy chill down my spine. Rationally, I knew it was probably just space junk, or the station's metal frame expanding, but it was unsettling enough for me to give the capsule a nervous once-over before my thoughts reluctantly returned to the radio. Soyuz 21, do you read? I picked up the microphone, my gaze still fixed on the main console, where the display stubbornly insisted on 19.8 degree, receiving OPS-3. Zudov's voice a fragile tether to sanity. Any contact with ground yet, Commander? I really need to get a fix on this thermostat problem. Negative, Boris. Still nothing. Is it getting worse? I can cope, but if it persists, for another 2 or 3 days. I trailed off, putting down the receiver to wipe my forehead again. In the polished edge of the porthole, my reflection stared back, a sweaty, haunted stranger. White salt crystals were already forming on my forearm in the rapidly drying sweat. Well, we'll keep trying. It'll be fixed in a couple of hours more, I'm sure of it. His optimism sounded forced, even over the crackle of the radio. I hope so, or I'll have to take another shower just to think straight. You're still getting a reading of 19.8? Zudov's voice carried a distinct note of apprehension now. Afraid so. Don't worry, Boris. We'll be back in contact with the ground, soon. They'll know what to do. I'm sure it's just a sensor problem, I said, trying to convince myself as much as him. Something minor. Speak to you soon, my friend, and drink plenty of water. I will, don't worry. I managed a weak laugh. The man was acting like my mother. With Zudov no better equipped to solve the problem than I was, I relented to a policy of grim acceptance. If I couldn't fix it, I would simply have to endure it. Chapter 4. A Fleeting Reprieve. The heat had obliterated what little appetite I had left, but I forced myself towards the kitchen area, hoping to choke down some crackers and water. I rifled through the storage cupboards, searching for something, anything, that wouldn't turn my stomach. The crackers were gone. Eventually, I settled on a packet of nondescript dried beef. It reeked of preservatives, an acrid, pungent stink that set my abdomen churning. But I swallowed it down nonetheless, a dry, tasteless lump. The scent of the dried beef clung to the kitchen walls long after I'd finished the meager portion. My mouth was now even drier, a desert of salt and regret. I mixed up some of the powdered orange juice. It tasted nothing like orange, more like a cocktail of harsh chemicals. But it washed away the lingering tang of the beef. I wiped my mouth and discarded the plastic container, watching it trail small, sticky globules of orange liquid as It drifted across the cabin. After my meal, a heavy weight settled in my stomach. It sloshed around unpleasantly as I moved about the station, warm and stinging. I had to clamp my throat shut to stop myself from throwing up on several occasions. The day passed in an uncomfortable malaise that amplified the discomfort in my stomach and the throbbing in my head. I watched the hours tick away on the main console clock as I mechanically performed my duties. Measurements, recordings of the sun, observations of the box of crystals that grew with agonizing slowness in the science lab area. Eventually, I could take the drudgery, the heat, the nausea no longer. Every surface in the station was covered in my sweaty palm prints by the time the day was officially done. My hair was nearly sodden. There was no way I could sleep in this oppressive heat. I knew it. So, when I couldn't endure the treacle, consistency of waking consciousness for another minute, I relented. The sleeping pills. They sat in a tiny white bottle in the very back of the medicine compartment. At the start of the mission, I had sworn I'd never take them, but tonight there was no other option. Dimming the station lights, I crawled into the hot, confining embrace of my sleeping bag. I looked at the pale white pills nestled in my palm. They had a faint, almost imperceptible scent of mint. In one decisive movement, I quashed all hesitation, all internal protest. I closed my eyes and swallowed. I was out like a light. The first thing I noticed when I woke was the temperature. A gentle, cool breeze lapped around my face, probably emanating from the air pumps that whirred softly on the edges of my hearing. My watch, still set to Alma Ata time from my launch at Baikonur, informed me I had been asleep for only 3 hours. The station was still dark as I slid open the sleeping compartment door. I was thankful for the respite from the heat, if not the pervasive gloom. I stretched, feeling the vertebrae in my back crack. Here, in the cool dark, I no longer felt feverish or nauseous. Just tired. Bone tired. Slowly, as my eyes adjusted, I pulled myself towards the radio set. I considered calling Soyuz 21. The air still tasted stale. The tang of sweat and dried beef hung in it even after being recycled hundreds of times through endless filters and pumps. Even so, there was a certain calm to the station with the lights off and the temperature blessedly down. I looked out the porthole. Even the frigid depths of the universe seemed less inhospitable. There was a gentle navy tinge to the infinite blackness, perhaps, and the glow of the stars seemed less harsh, more welcoming. This, along with the weightlessness and the gentle purr of the air pumps, gave the whole scene a dreamlike quality, as if I were safely cocooned in a great white chrysalis, floating through the spiraling arms of far-off galaxies, or across the peaks and valleys of great sparkling nebulae. I could go wherever I wanted in this dream space. I was safe wherever I went, all of that serenity shattered with the noise. A clatter, movement, almost imperceptible, in the corner of my right eye. I was instantly torn from my trance, tossed back, cruelly into the physical realm. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled to attention. I turned, slowly, to face the source of the noise behind me. Nothing. Perhaps I had imagined it. After all, things tend not to clatter in microgravity. They float. They drift heedlessly. But they don't clatter. So it stood to reason it had simply been my mind playing tricks on me, manifesting noise where there was none. Nothing in that section of the station showed any sign of movement. Nervously gazing around the cabin, I shook my head, a silent rebuke to the power of my own imagination and my initial foolishness for believing it. Nothing on the station could have made such a noise. In an attempt to settle myself again, I swam over to the main console and checked the thermometer reading. 19.8 degrees Celsius, just as I was expecting. Either the problem had mysteriously fixed itself, and the temperature control had automatically cooled the station back to its programmed 19.8 degrees, or the problem was still there, but it was with the thermometer itself, not the temperature control system. Either way, I was immensely relieved not to be doused in sweat any longer. I had quickly resigned myself to the fact that I wouldn't be getting any more sleep for a while. So, with a defeated sigh, I flicked the switch for the main cabin lights. They blinked on one by one with a deep, guttural hum, which was soon lost in the orchestra of other quiet whirs and buzzes. The light hit my pupils with a ferocious intensity. I had to close my eyes to shield them. I had become adjusted to the comfortable dark, and my eyes were shocked by this new, unwelcome stimulus. The next order of business was to put some clothes on. In my sleeping underwear, I was beginning to feel a slight chill. I would be a lot more comfortable in something warmer. Soyuz 21, do you read? I pulled up the zip on my jumpsuit as I spoke. After a moment of silence, I leaned closer towards. The radio mouthpiece licked my lips slightly to moisten them and tried again. Soyuz 21, do you read? Receiving, comrade, what can I do for you? The faint reply came. It was good to hear Commander Zudov's voice again, a familiar anchor in the disorienting quiet. Just wanted to tell you that the sensor problem is all cleared up, Commander. We're back at usual temperature. That's brilliant. Zudov was clearly relieved. I was worried for a minute there, Boris. How did you fix it? I breathed heavily, trying to form a response. The pause must have lasted a good second or two because Zudov transmitted again, his voice edged with concern. Boris, are you there? How did you fix the temperature problem? I didn't do anything, I decided on eventually. It just went away on its own. Zudov wasn't pleased, clearly. His tone was flat, devoid of its earlier relief. I'm just glad it's back to normal again, I added, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Well, yes, so am I. I'll talk to you soon. Zudov's voice was slightly frosty in this dismissal. I'll look forward to it. The radio crackled with static, before falling silent completely. I replaced the microphone and pushed myself away from the set, towards the main console with the intent of once again checking the temperature. I gave an unconvincing laugh when I saw it was still stuck at 19.8°. This was becoming my new obsession. Chapter 5. The cracks. Appear with the temperature seemingly back to normal and the oppressive nausea gone, I was convinced I'd be able to make a better job of diagnosing the problem with the heating control or the thermometer. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case. I managed to spend several hours once again vainly trying to plow my way through hundreds of wiring diagrams and circuit board schematics. My mind, however, refused to cooperate. Eventually, my frontal cortex began to throb with a dull, persistent ache from the sheer mental exertion. It was an acute pressure that pulsed up my brainstem, across my scalp, and seemed to press outwards from my eye sockets. At one point, it became so bad I had to let go of the manual I was reading to massage my forehead, a primal fear gripping me that my skull might actually explode. My vision blurred. Bright red and blue patterns scarred themselves across my retinas, like sheet lightning. Pins and needles crawled up my legs and arms, starting in my extremities, then soaking upwards and inwards, across my thighs and forearms. There was a rushing in my ears that drowned out most other sounds, but I just barely heard an odd, drawn-out croak on the very edge of my audible range. It took a few seconds for me to realize that the noise was sliding from my own wide-open jaws. The pain was unbearable. Every second I felt like I was about to drown in a sea of swirling fractals, like the dam in my mind was going to shatter open and my entire consciousness would be washed away by a flood of jarring kaleidoscopic flashes. With numb hands, I flung myself towards my sleeping compartment. Any second now, I knew I would pass out from the searing heat in my head. I wanted to be in my sleeping bag when it happened, so I didn't float aimlessly around the capsule while unconscious. I could barely see by the time I reached the sleeping bag. As I fumbled for the restraints, the world dissolved. My face felt like it was splitting apart, melting, exposing a bare skull, hard bone peeling back like warm butter. From the chasm in the front of my head, a blinding light spilt out. Heat, splashing across my skin. More fractures opened across my temples and the back of my scalp beneath my hair. I could see my own brain, separating into regular pulsating sections like a gelatinous white clementine. Or at least that's what it felt like. The pain was too much. I screwed my eyes shut, and my mind, mercifully, shut down. I awoke, staring, at the plastic wall of my sleeping compartment utterly drained. The banging in my head had subsided from the feverish dance of a several hundred-strong warrior tribe in the midst of a ferocious and primal ritual to the distant rumble of thunder above a darkened grassland, accompanied by the gentle crackle of rain. With some trepidation, I pulled at my sleeping bag and climbed out, waiting for the pain to return. But as my sweaty fingers played around the door handle, the fear subsided. I gingerly slid open the door and floated out into the dark station. The main lights were off, casting the living area and the flight deck into an uncomfortable darkness, thick as honey, seeping from every joining of the spaceship walls. It was split only by the bright neon of the station clock and the main console, which sliced through the viscous black with beams of gently sharp green light, bouncing off the walls, battling the darkness for control of the spaces above my head and below my feet. Another creak yawned through the capsule as I pulled myself out to the flight deck towards the radio. It still sent shivers down my spine, despite the fact I knew it was just the metal contracting due to a drop in temperature. Soyuz 21, do you read? Receiving OPS 3. The man on the other end of the radio wasn't Commander Zudov. I hesitated when I recognized Flight Engineer Rojdestvensky's dry sandpaper rasp. How is it going over there, Flight Engineer? I didn't like Rojdestvensky. It wasn't that he was particularly unpleasant. In fact, he had been mostly amicable whenever I had talked to him. It wasn't even his rough voice, grating like sandpaper in my ears. It was his quiet lack of engagement, not only with the mission, but with the whole of space. He always seemed distant, far, far away. Not like Zudov, who was only ever as far as the radio speakers. All is fine, comrade. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection. Is Commander Zudov there? He's getting some sleep at the moment. I see. Have you had any contact with the ground yet? Sorry. He sounded genuinely confused. Have the problems? With the solar flares died down? You've reached ground on the radio communication network? Oh yes, the solar flares, of course. No, we are still unable to reach them. His reply was too quick, too practiced. Right, well, can you keep trying? Yes, of course, it's our top priority. Okay, thank you. I hesitated before closing with my usual comment to Zudov. See you in 4 days. I suppose so. Rojdestvensky was distant, almost uninterested by the entire conversation. The radio went silent, leaving me with just the hiss of dead air, which rippled gently off the skin of the capsule, so it sounded like it was coming from every corner of the spacecraft at once. I flicked off the radio and tossed down the mouthpiece, watching it float on its coil for a few seconds before heading away to the shower compartment. 4 days. That's what I kept telling myself, as I sat at the main console, flicking slowly through diagnostic programs, the bright green of the screen washing over the rest of the module. I had kept the lights off for now. It was so much more comfortable in the dark. With the bright lights constantly in my face, I could hardly concentrate. 4 more days. The sentence fragment that escaped my mouth was a surprise even to me. It was next to silent, and if I hadn't been completely alone up here, I would have dismissed it as background noise. I hadn't ever been one to talk to myself, and I was determined not to start now. My palms, still damp from the shower I hadn't taken, had left prints where I had been clutching the armrests of the seat. With a start, I realized my hands had been clenched just a few seconds ago, tightly around the plastic. Just 4 more days. There was something off in the cabin. I could just feel it now. The equilibrium was disturbed. Something had been moved, in the corner of my eye. Swirling around, I scanned the living area, suddenly aware of a slight, almost imperceptible change in the capsule. Once you live in a space for long enough, you become accustomed to every tiny detail. Even the slightest difference is like a blaring air raid siren. The medical cupboard was open. I realized it with a jolt. It was only slightly ajar, maybe just wide enough for me to fit my hand into, but it was noticeable enough for me to catch it on my second glance. How had it gotten open? I thought for a second, just floating silently, staring at the open cupboard. It had a sliding door, so it wasn't something that could just drift open with a draft. Not that there was one up here. How long had it been like that? It was impossible to tell. I finally willed my body into action, done with quietly staring, and crossed over to the cupboard. Perhaps I had left it open when I got the sleeping pills out last night. My train of thought faltered. Had it been last night? Or the night before that I had taken the pills? I couldn't remember properly. Nothing was in chronological order anymore. My memories were becoming a tangled, unreliable mess. I slid open the cupboard fully and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. Nothing had moved. The sleeping pills were still politely hidden behind bandages and unlabeled vitamin tablets, keeping up with the fiction that I never used them, that I could get to sleep on my own. Chapter 6. The Black Nebula, Ops 3. Zudov's voice crackled through the radio. I was almost asleep, slumped in the command chair, my eyes barely open more, then a slit. Ops 3, do you read? I read you, comrade, I mumbled, my voice thick with fatigue. How are you doing up there? Are you well? His tone was solicitous, almost too gentle. I must have hesitated for a second too long, because Zudov was suddenly nervous. What's happened? He demanded before I could speak. Nothing. I'm fine. A blatant lie. Don't lie to me, Boris. I can tell something is wrong. His use of my first name, usually a comfort, now felt off. I sighed audibly, then immediately regretted it. That would only be more confirmation to Zudov about my deteriorating state of mind. Commander Volinov? His voice was sharper now. I've been having sleep problems. Sleep problems? That's normal, so I hear. Weren't you briefed on that? Took the pills. The sleeping pills. The admission felt like a betrayal of some unspoken rule. You took them? His surprise sounded genuine. Yes, they worked fine. We had been instructed back in Shchelkovo 14, the cosmonaut training facility, to not take the pills unless it was absolutely necessary, and under no circumstances to take more than 4 at a time. I didn't mention how many I'd actually taken. That's it, just taking sleeping pills? He didn't sound convinced. No, I hesitated again, this time because my voice was caught on the saliva at the edge of my windpipe. There's something else. My memory. It's getting fuzzy sometimes. What do you mean? I can't remember things properly. Today I found a cupboard open and I don't remember opening it. There was nothing but silence for nearly 30 seconds. I thought Zudov had abandoned me, the radio hissing with an empty cosmic indifference. Okay. Look, Boris, he said finally, his voice strained. I have to go. I have to check our oxygen filters. I'll talk to you soon. He was obviously distracted. Over the crackle of interference, I could hear a faint muttering in the background. Another voice I couldn't quite make out. Rozdestvensky? Right. I'll see you in 4 days. Or 3. The days were blurring. The sun was just slipping through the blue band of Earth's atmosphere as I took a quick glance from the flight deck porthole. It was almost fully extinguished, but long tails of light flared up through the dark, the last swan song of the soon-to-be-gone star. Sleep is a very loose term for what I experienced that night. I climbed into the sleeping compartment and stared at the blank plastic wall. At some nondescript time, I fell into a semi-aware, semi-unconscious state. Not sleep, but somewhere in between, where my mind wandered through dark, disjointed landscapes. I was awoken, again, in the loosest sense of the word, by another thermal ping, a sharp crack from the station's hull. There was the faint, acrid taste of vomit and chemicals on the back of my throat. My eyes were watering, thick streams of salty tears running down my face, soaking into the neck of my sleep shirt. I didn't remember taking sleeping pills, but I couldn't deny the artificial mint that still clung to my mouth and nasal cavity. It could only belong to the pills. I hadn't eaten anything in days, certainly not anything mint-flavored. With a groan, I probed the very edges of my sleeping bag, feeling the strain in my muscles. They were tense, taut. It took some effort to get them to move. With every slightest adjustment of my limbs came the sting of built-up lactic acid. The air in the sleeping compartment was stale, old. It felt like it had been through my lungs at least 10 times before, and it hung around me with a dreadful stillness. As I pulled myself from the sleeping bag, I could still smell the musk of my skin, my sweat. Everything reeked of it. Everything reeked of me. I opened the door and my heart stopped. It stopped pumping. Warm blood turned cold in my veins, stationary. The contents of my stomach turned to ice, a great slush of freezing water that weighed down on my body and digestive system, if only figuratively. Thousands of goosebumps rippled across my bare arms and legs, the nerves in my skin suddenly several hundred degrees below zero. Black powder floated in a small, dense cloud in the center of the living space. It looked for all the world like a nebula gone dark. Hundreds of tiny swirling peaks and troughs made of an infinite number of black pinpricks. Lord, I breathed, disbelievingly. The carbon filter spun at the center of it all, glinting dangerously in the dim emergency lights, disgorging more trails of carbon powder as it turned seemingly randomly through its own malevolent cloud. How had it got there? How the fuck had it got there? Good Lord, I repeated, my voice a hoarse whisper, as I swam towards the cloud. I reached out, extending my hand through the dust, and clamped it around the filter. It was a small metal box, about the size of a paperback book, with an opening at one end where the carbon was leaking from. The filter usually sat deep within the whirring mass of the air filtration system. There was an access panel used to change it located on the flight deck. My eyes immediately flicked up towards it when I remembered its location. Sure enough, it hung open, a dark accusing maw. Soyuz 21? Soyuz 21? My voice into the radio was barely more than a whisper. In my head, my mind screamed, trying to drown out the terrifying, uncertain knowledge I had gained since waking up. I was looking for an explanation. Any explanation. Perhaps there had been some micro-debris impacts that had shaken the filter loose. I hadn't felt anything, but then I wouldn't have. Not if I'd taken the sleeping pills. Perhaps there had been a pressure malfunction, and that had blown the access panel open and the filter out. Perhaps. There were so many possibilities, but no answers. Only the chilling, silent accusation of the floating black dust. Receiving Ops 3. Zudov's voice was a thin thread in the sudden chaos. Comrade. Vyacheslav. I used Zudov's first name in my strange state of shock, trying to connect with him across the void, across the great, terrifying gap. I choked up, looking at the open access panel and the filter which I had left floating by it, a dark sentinel. When my throat cleared, my voice was barely a whisper. There's something wrong, comrade. There's something very, very wrong. Commander Volinov, what is the problem? Zudov was cold, distant. I could hear a strange silence as his voice echoed away around his own capsule. I couldn't speak. I couldn't say a single word. How could I explain this? I decided to keep it simple, to ignore the terrifying implications of what had happened, to keep what I said to facts and nothing more. There's a problem. With the air filtering system. What kind of problem, Ops 3? One of the carbon filters he done fell out, or got knocked out, or... There I trailed off. After that point, the facts did not serve me very well. There was nothing I could say for certain. Do you think it's fixable? He asked, his voice devoid of alarm, almost bored. Of course it's fixable, but that's not the point. My voice cracked with frustration. Say again, Ops 3. I need you to contact ground, Soyuz. Please, as fast as you can. My plea was desperate. I can't do that, comrade. The long-range communications are still out because of solar flares. The same excuse. It felt hollow now. Okay. Thank you, Commander. See you in 3 days. I was cold. My spine was chilled with the sharp tingle of nerves. Zudov was never this businesslike, never this disinterested. It scared me even more than the problem with the carbon filter. If I could have seen him, I felt like he would not have batted an eyelid when I told him about it. I was on my own, it seemed. Not even the comfort of my old friend on the other end of the radio. With Zudov in his current mood, I felt like talking to him any longer would be pointless. I began to rationalize in my head, and the primal spasms of fear inside me began to die down, momentarily comforted by warm and concrete logic. Nothing to fear. I had nothing to fear. I needed something to calm my nerves. We weren't allowed alcohol aboard the station, of course, but I was pretty sure there were some anxiety pills in the medicine cabinet. Pills. It was always pills. They were in another white bottle marked with black text. They tasted like chalk, no artificial mint this time. As I felt the large lump slide down my throat, my heart rate began to slow, the panic receding to a dull throb. Chapter 7. The Unseen Visitor. Maybe half an hour passed before I began to really feel the effects of the anxiety pills. I could feel my heart beating heavily and slowly in my chest, each thump further away from the last but heavier, the mass of muscle and veins straining as if to release itself from the confines of my fleshy body. Time was slowing down, stretching like taffy. As I watched the sun slowly creep up across the curved edge of the earth, the names of all the pills and tablets I had been taking began to run through my head. Aminoglutaric acid, atenolol, Decaris, Grandaxin, Oletatrine. The list stretched on and on. The names didn't mean anything, just odd foreign words that were a problem to pronounce and an even bigger problem to spell. Labels on bottles that promised relief but delivered only. A deeper, more insidious confusion. A small bead of sweat was forming on my forehead. I could feel it just above my left eye. There were others, I was sure, and I imagined they rippled each time my heart gave another ponderous thump. Nothing now but the sound of my heartbeat and the porthole in front of me. My vision began to focus inwards, the edges blurring out. I was very close to the glass now, despite the fact I hadn't moved an inch. My field of view was rapidly zooming in on the geometric curve of the earth, as it was caressed by dark, swirling clouds. Everything else had passed out of my view, now just a stretched and blurred mass on the peripheries of my vision. I was through the glass somehow, and now looking at the vast face of the earth as it turned seductively into the light of the sun, that great, scorched ball of searing, indifferent heat. My journey down was starting to speed up. Still slow at first, I barely surpassed the speed of Salyut's orbit, but soon my acceleration brought me up to greater, terrifying speeds. The blue planet loomed up in front of me, and I was falling into its great, yawning maw. The void whipped past me as my speed reached unimaginable levels. The atmosphere was beginning to glow around my vision, burning first yellow, then white hot. Clouds parted, and the patchwork green of the country sped towards me, seconds from impact. Jerking awake, I was pulled from my hallucination by the heavy, frantic beating of my heart. The pearl of sweat on my forehead had evaporated, leaving just a tiny white deposit of salt crystals. I was fine. I was still here. Just a slight dizziness, a lingering vertigo remained from my terrifying plunge. I needed a drink, I decided. I needed a drink and something to eat. My mouth felt like it was full of rock salt, and I really needed to wash that out. I grabbed a water bottle and started to drink the rubber-tinged water as I rooted through the cupboards and cabinets, trying to find some food that would be inoffensive to my rebellious stomach. Beef stew, it seemed, was the best choice. It came in a small tin that didn't require heating. Ripping off the lid of the can, a small blob of brown stew was dislodged from inside. I watched it spiral away across the kitchen area, a miniature, grotesque comet. It slammed into the side of one of the kitchen cabinets with a violent splat, leaving a dark brown smudge. I didn't have the energy to clean it. Sat at the flight console, I tried to run the diagnostic program again. I wanted to find out what time the filter had blown out, and why the alarm hadn't gone off. Lines of code flickered down the screen, repeating over and over again as I tried to connect with the diagnostic system. I could hear the memory disks whirring loudly as they strained to figure out what the sensors were doing, or rather, what they weren't doing. The computer insisted nothing was wrong. No alarms had been reported, no problems detected, nothing. It was as if nothing had happened. The diagnostic finished, and flashed up the results. 0 errors found. I slammed the side of the screen with my fist. It flickered, then stabilized. With a frustrated groan, I tore myself out of the console chair and headed back to the living area. I was starting to get jittery. The air was cold, or at least it felt like it. The whole incident had given me an uncomfortable, prickling feeling about the station, and the cocktail of pills certainly didn't help. My skin crawled just thinking about it. The small noises, the beeps and thumps, the hiss of air pumps and groan of metal, I noticed every single one now. Goosebumps rippled across my skin every time I heard something even slightly out of place. I was a wreck by the time 2 hours had passed. The cumulative sum of every single tiny rattle or creak had set my teeth grating and shredded my nerves. I was totally prepared for the station to start plummeting back towards the earth at any second. Every time the filter system gave a hiss, I was convinced a leak had sprung, and I was going to be sucked out into the cold vacuum of space through a hole the size of my nostril, squeezed into a fine red paste as I was spit out across the atmosphere, my liquidized entrails slowly spiraling across the cloudy skies. I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to put myself out of my misery, at least temporarily. Sleep would be ignorance of any problem, and ignorance, I told myself, was bliss. I repeated this mantra over and over as I pulled the pills from the medical cabinet, the sleeping pills this time, and downed 2 without hesitation, followed by a quick sip from my water bottle. Ignorance was bliss. Ignorance was bliss. Blackness clawed at the edge of my vision as I climbed into the sleeping bag. The pills were beginning to take effect. I closed my eyes and was ferried away from that ticking metal coffin in the sky. I didn't dream, of course. I never dreamt, up here, but I enjoyed a few hours of comfortable, welcome blackness. When I awoke, the pill bottle was still clutched in my hand. I had it pressed up against my chest in the warm confines of my sleeping bag. There was a slight buzzing coming from the strip light on the roof I had never noticed before. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just disquieting, especially having only just woken up. I studied it carefully, until my retinas were scorched blue by the bright glow. I closed my eyes and tried to shake off its imprint on the back of my eyes. Sweat caked itself on my body as it always did when I woke up. I couldn't wait to get the sleeping garment off and have a shower. It was always too warm in the sleeping bag. From outside the small box of my compartment, I heard a noise, an echoing thump. Just a thermal ping, I told myself, just the metal, expanding and contracting outside. Nothing more. Still, I was frozen in my place, listening out for any other noise, despite telling myself there was nothing to fear. Then came another thump, another deep, echoing thump. The color must have drained from my face because my entire body went cold when I heard it. I almost felt the blood being squeezed from my veins. I began to squirm in my sleeping bag, trying to free my arm so I could tear off the restraints that stopped me floating around the compartment while I slept. I was aching to get out, the noises outside making me suddenly intensely uncomfortable. Then came the third thump. This couldn't be just a fluke. This couldn't just be heat expansions. I stopped thrashing for a second and listened, my breath caught in my throat. Thump. There it was again. It was regular, some kind of repetitive banging sound. It was coming from the opposite side of the station near the flight deck. The next one, however, sounded slightly closer, and the one after that more so. The gaps between the bangs began to decrease, getting closer each time. They were footsteps. I was still strapped into the sleeping bag when I came to this realization, and whatever chills had run across my body before now paled in comparison to this. It was like I had been dropped from my warm sleeping compartment to the dark, frozen wastes of Siberia, spinning madly as I fell. Fear and a light-headed dizziness consumed me. The footsteps were getting closer. I heard a slight pause as they reached the small step where the flight deck transitioned into the living area. Shivers racked my body as I fumbled with the straps, trying to get out before whatever was the source of the footsteps reached me. My mind reeled, unable to think over the pounding of footsteps. This couldn't be real. This could not be real. The straps came loose. I wriggled out of the bag, the footsteps shaking the whole station as they got closer. Great crashing impacts just feet away now. I was sobbing. a raw animal sound as I went to the door handle, pressing it shut in a vain attempt to keep whatever was out there from getting in. There was one final step, as the source of the sound came face to face with the door of my sleeping compartment. Then, silence. I could hear my own heavy, ragged breathing as I pressed my ear up to the plastic of the door, listening out for whatever was out there. Nothing. Just silence. A silence more terrifying than the noise. Thump. Something heavy slammed into the door. I jumped back in terror, slamming my head and body against the back wall. The impact echoed away, and the station fell into silence once again. Several minutes passed before I plucked up the courage to move. Not a single sound had disturbed the silence up to that point, and I had been forced to listen in terror to the sound of my own desperate, shallow breaths. Gingerly, I clasped the handle and listened. Still nothing. Everything sounded calm out there. Too calm. With one convulsive movement, I swallowed and threw open the sliding door. I winced at the squeak of its rollers. The station expanded before me, seemingly huge, dark, and utterly empty. The whole space was stationary and quiet. Nothing out here. I remained there for a few seconds, watching like a nervous gazelle at a watering hole, wary of predators stalking in the long grass. Slowly, I pulled myself out. I felt like I was riddled with the eyes of hundreds, all watching me. My skin suddenly felt very vulnerable, exposed. Whatever was out here, it scared me beyond what I thought was possible. It showed me the cracks in the facade of reality, the terrifying possibilities lurking just beyond perception. Slowly, I began to move towards the kitchen, running my eyes over every surface, my body weak and shaking. The air was warm and still, and I began to try and steady my breathing. I kept darting my eyes, though, convinced something was waiting for me, just out of my field of view, ready to pounce. I think there's someone here, I hissed into the radio, looking over my shoulder as I did. Soyuz, do you read? I think there's someone here. The response that came through the speakers was crackly and garbled, pierced occasionally by harsh electronic tones or the buzz of static. But through the noise, a melody emerged, faint and distorted, yet unmistakable. It was Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 in B-flat minor. I recognized it from a long time ago, from a different life. No words, just music. Haunting, beautiful, and utterly out of place. Soyuz 21, do you read? I repeated, my voice trembling, as the music stopped and the transmission faded away into static. Commander, answer me. There was nothing, except another, quick taunting burst of the music. It lasted a few seconds before stopping again. Leaning down, I examined the frequency dial. Sure enough, I was on the correct frequency. Please, I begged, tears welling up in my eyes out of sheer, unadulterated fear. The fear of my only lifeline to the outside world, to sanity, being severed. Nothing. Except the music. It didn't stop this time. It carried on, swelling to fill the small cabin with its melancholic grandeur. It lasted a good minute before the song reached its conclusion, and I was once again left in shocked, ringing silence. With a numbness in my heart, I placed the mouthpiece back down on its stand and pulled myself from the chair. I was alone up here. Or maybe I wasn't. And maybe whoever else was there and myself were just alone together. It made no sense. How could someone else be up here? How could there be someone on the station without me knowing? There was nowhere to hide. I saw every inch of the pressurized space of the ship every single day. Then it struck me. There was one place I didn't go. One place I hadn't dared to look. Flight Engineer Zholobov's sleeping compartment. It had been undisturbed, sealed, since the day he had left. I turned around to face it, looking at the door with a new, surging intensity. A desperate hope mixed with a profound dread that I hadn't been capable of before. Chapter 8. The observer's ledger, it was locked. When I tried the handle, it didn't budge. I couldn't remember whether it had been me or Zholobov who had locked it that day, though I was certain I didn't know where the key was, even if it was still on the station. The keyhole was tiny, a mere slit, not wide enough to look through, and even if it had been, it would have been too dark on the other side to see anything. I had to find a way to open it. The kitchen was my first stop. I found the knife. It was a standard-issue utility blade, metal with a flat plastic handle about 8 inches long. It glinted alluringly in the powerful station lights. I pulled off the plastic sheath that covered the blade and headed for Zholobov's door. With all my furious energy, all my fear, I pounded the knife into the door. The blade sank in perhaps an inch before I pulled it out again and gave another powerful stab at the plastic. This time the blade slid in better all the way up to the handle. When I pulled it out, a sliver of light from the main cabin flooded into the darkened compartment. Slipping my hand around the door frame to keep myself in place, I gave a mighty kick. The plastic cracked and splintered. It was only about 1/3 of an inch thick, so my bare foot went through the hole my knife had wrought pretty easily, collecting several sharp plastic splinters as it went. Withdrawing my now stinging foot, I quickly pulled out the splinters, wincing. Then I tore open the door, which now hung loosely off its rail, skewed and broken. The inside of the compartment was a dark coffin, nearly identical to mine in layout. But it smelt terrible, of dried blood, old sweat, and other unidentifiable, biological things. I guess the blood, which was now a rust-colored stain on the sleeping bag that hung on one wall, had come from the night Zholobov had spent in here while we waited for a Soyuz to evacuate him. I had bandaged his hand pretty badly, I recalled, but it had leaked dark crimson and translucent yellow fluids all night. He had been in such pain. I could hear him from outside the compartment whispering to himself and occasionally sobbing. I had been the one tasked with the gruesome endeavor of scraping his severed fingers off the inside of the airlock hatch. The memory, sharp and visceral, came flooding back. All this replayed in my mind as I hung nervously in the entrance of his compartment. I flicked on the light. It spilled an appealing, almost cheerful orange glow across the scene with a soft buzz. The first thing I noticed were the pill bottles. There were at least 10 of them floating around near the floor, their shiny labels daubed with bright reflections. I picked one up and looked at the label. General Painkillers. I gave a low whistle. There were enough painkillers here to make an elephant numb. Or there would have been if the bottles hadn't all been empty. Every single one. Had Zholobov been taking them? Was he an addict? Another, more sinister possibility formed itself in my mind. Had he taken them all in one go? Had he been preparing himself for an accident? Had he deliberately sliced off his own fingers? With the amount of painkillers here, he wouldn't have felt a thing as that heavy hatch had come down on his hand, began to root around. A knot of dread tightening in my stomach, worried about what else I would find. The stench of body odor was strong, overpowering. I guess it had been fermenting in here for a while. Then I found the notebook. It was wrapped in plain brown paper. When I found it, I was a little confused. It was small, about the size of my palm, and had a black, nondescript cover. Flipping it open on a random page, I found that it was filled with Zholobov's distinctive, almost illegible scrawl he called handwriting. It read July 17th. Boris woke up 5:45 ALMT, took shower for 12 minutes at 5:49 ALMT. When finished, shaved for approx. 5 minutes, missed several spots. Left shower compartment 6:05 ALMT, headed to living area, drank approx. 200 ml of water, ate. Breakfast, dried fruit, 1 cracker. And so it continued. I felt sick, bile rose in my throat. This was about me. This was a detailed, meticulous record of my activities that day, right down to accounts of our conversations, things I'd long forgotten. I flicked to the next page, and sure enough, there was a description of my activities on July 18th. It was written in eye-watering, obsessive detail, from the amount of time I spent on the toilet to how I ate and drank, what I said, even what I seemed to be thinking. It was almost clinical. Going through the book, there was an entry for each day since we had launched from Baikonur, right up to 3 days before the accident. I could feel a lump forming in my throat, all sympathy I had ever held for my former flight engineer rapidly draining away. replaced by a cold, creeping horror. Whatever this was, it was disgusting, invasive, unhinged. Slowly, coldly, I wrapped the notebook back in the brown paper, placed it back down on the shelf where I'd found it, and backed out into the living area. Whatever was happening here, Jolobov had been in on it. Why had he stopped? Surely giving up just 2 days before the accident couldn't be a coincidence. Ops 3, do you read? Please confirm, Ops 3? The radio was barking behind me, Zudov's voice urgent. I ignored it, still staring at the violated compartment, my jaw slack. How long had the radio been calling? I didn't know. Still, I didn't rush to answer Commander Zudov's transmission. I moved slowly, without a definite purpose, keeping my eyes fixed on Jolobov's dark, silent sleeping compartment. What the fuck? I finally swore loudly into the mouthpiece, my voice raw with a mixture of anger and fear. Where the hell have you been? Say again, Ops 3. I do not understand. Zudov's voice was carefully neutral. Why have you been ignoring my transmission, Soyuz? Rage bubbled through my voice, but I tried to keep it even, for the sake of anyone back on Earth who may, by some miracle, have been listening. Ops 3, we have received no transmission from you since yesterday. A flat denial. That's a lie. You were sending out that music. Listen, Ops 3. Zudov's voice softened, taking on a placating tone. I've talked to flight engineer Rojdestvensky. We're both very worried about you. We think perhaps you're having some kind of breakdown. Breakdown? I murmured slowly, the word hanging heavy in the stale air. No, I'm not having... It's perfectly understandable in your position, Boris. Perfectly normal. Zudov purred, his voice slow and gentle like a doctor soothing a frightened child. Nobody blames you. All the stress you've been put under. A breakdown, I repeated once again, the possibility chilling me to the core. Was it possible? Could I actually be going insane? Yes. You've been up there alone so long. You started to imagine things. Started to see things. Are you sure? My voice was a whisper. Perhaps we should come early, Boris. Perhaps we should come and help you. Something about Zudov's voice, a subtle inflection, hinted at a hidden malignance beneath his words, no longer hidden by his forced friendliness, a pretense he was clearly straining to keep up. It sent fresh chills down my spine. No, that won't be necessary. I think it will, Boris. I think we'll have to set a course for Salyut 5 right now. His voice was firm, decisive. No, I mean I don't want to disrupt the mission. I gave a nervous, unconvincing chuckle. The mission? That's what's important. Zudov was silent for a second, considering my comments. The station was filled with the sound of static, the empty hiss of the void. I prayed he would agree to stay away for another 2 days. There was something about Zudov now, something I'd only just noticed that scared me deeply. The more time I spent away from him, the better. Yes, of course you can manage 2 days, he said finally, his voice once again smooth and reassuring. You should get some sleep, though. Take the sleeping pills. You sound tired. I'll do that. See you in 2 days, then. Get some sleep, Boris. We'll be here before you know it. How long had he been referring to me by my first name? That was against protocol. Everything's going to be fine. I placed the mouthpiece back on the clip and swallowed nervously. 2 days, stuck up here. I was now unsure which option was worse. Being trapped up here with whatever horrors were unfolding, or being trapped on the Soyuz with the smooth-talking, increasingly unsettling Zudov. Chapter 9. Descent into Doubt. I mulled over what Zudov had said. A breakdown. It seemed entirely possible, disturbingly plausible. The things I'd seen, the things I'd heard, they couldn't be real, could they? Footsteps weren't possible in microgravity. That's what I told myself, clinging to the frayed edges of logic. But the implication of everything being just a hallucination was equally sinister. Was I going insane? Everything had seemed so real when it had been happening. The notebook. It had felt real in my hands. The footsteps couldn't have just been in my imagination, could they? And the carbon filter? Had that really come loose from its piping at all? Or was it another phantom of my fracturing mind? It would explain why the computer never detected any faults. They had all been in my head. The station was fine. It was me who was broken. There was one cast iron way to prove all this, of course. I could go back to Zholobov's compartment. I could unwrap the brown paper and I could look at the notebook. If it wasn't a paranoia-fueled hallucination, all the writing would still be there. If it was just in my head, the writing would be gone. Or even better, the notebook wouldn't be there at all. Of course, it is never that simple. With a deep, trembling breath, I propelled myself back to the violated compartment. I tore open the brown paper. And there it was, the black notebook. With a nauseous reticence, my hand shaking, I opened the first page. The meticulous, damning script was still there. My stomach sank. With a sudden burst of rage and despair, I threw the book across the small room. It slammed against the far wall with a pathetic thud, then fluttered away. Pages splayed. There was nothing I could do then. It had been there, in my hands. Solid and real. Which meant I was left with two equally terrifying options. Either I hadn't been hallucinating, and the book, the footsteps, the filter, were all real manifestations of some unknown horror. Or I was further down the rabbit hole of my own collapsing sanity than I had dared to imagine. Both possibilities were, unfortunately, utterly terrifying. I needed some time, I decided. Time to figure out what to do. I needed to get things straight, in my head. I had to do something about this. I couldn't be paralyzed by inaction any longer. I couldn't take it. Slowly, I crossed back to the kitchen area, my hands trembling as I pulled my body through the air. All the while, my head pounded, heavy with the throb of blood and unanswered questions. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Then I remembered. The pills. Zudov had told me to take the pills. You sound tired. Perhaps I was. Zudov had never lied to me before, I noted, a desperate attempt to reassure myself. He wouldn't say anything that could put me in harm's way, surely. Commander Zudov had my best interests at heart. It was no use. I couldn't fool myself with those bullshit excuses about best interests. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I didn't trust that man anymore. Not for another velvet syllable that was wrought by his distant throat. Not for another instruction echoed across the void. I was done listening to him. My internal debate finished. I steadied my breathing and decided to look at my problem logically. I tried to block out the memories of the footsteps and the book and the filter, and just look at it from an objective point of view. That was pretty much all I could do at this point. I could take the pills, surrender to the oblivion they offered. Or I could sit here in terror and confusion for 2 more days waiting for Zudov, waiting for something else. I knew, like it or not, that I would have to take the pills at some point. I couldn't stay awake for another 2 days. Yet I couldn't sleep naturally. Not after everything that had happened. Natural sleep would be an impossibility. So, I took the pills. 2 more. I washed them down with a sip of water and soon felt myself drifting on an ocean of sticky black tar. It took all my remaining effort to simply pull myself back to my sleeping compartment and climb into the sleeping bag before I sank completely into the viscous black liquid of my mind, felt it soak into my skin and fill my lungs. Sleep was silent and black as always. Once again, the night passed without dreams, a small mercy. I was awoken once again by the incessant low hum of the strip light above my compartment. It all had the stirrings of some horrible recurring déjà vu. It gnawed at the pit of my stomach. All the knowledge, all the memories, and all the fear that it might happen again. There was something else there too, though. A new, unwelcome thought. The knowledge that possibly, just possibly, I might not be alone up here. Something was clearly very wrong, I reflected, and my policy of ignorance and pill-induced oblivion had failed so badly up to this point I was nearly sick with the realization. I needed to confront it. I needed to find whatever truth lay behind the terrifying events that were consuming me. Chapter 10. whispers of deceit. I climbed out of the sleeping compartment, a grim determination hardening within me, and looked around the dimly lit living area. It took me a second or two to see the writing. When I did, however, my heart stopped. Cold. It was everywhere, scrawled across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. Large and black, it had been smeared in some dark, viscous substance, perhaps. Using the end of a thumb, Christ. I shuddered at the sight of it, seeing something wholly unnatural and wholly unknown. It was an ugly, visceral confirmation of something that had lurked within the dark corners of my mind for days. It had been easy to be unafraid of the unknown when the unknown had been crammed in a locked safe in the back of my mind. Now, with the unknown on full, horrific view in front of me, in all its grotesque glory, it was impossible to deny my terror. The words themselves didn't mean anything coherent. They were just jumbles of numbers, random Russian phrases, disjointed symbols. No, it was their existence which scared me, the fact that they were there. It couldn't be real, I decided, a desperate mantra. It could not be real. Slowly, I turned around and climbed back into my sleeping compartment. I slid the door closed again and took a deep, shuddering breath. This was just in my head. It wasn't real. I was just imagining it, the fractured things in my head spilling out onto the walls of the station. When I opened the door again, it would be gone, I told myself. The writing would be gone. It was in my mind, and I was in control of my mind. I was in control. With another ragged breath, I slid open the door and looked out, praying, begging any god that might be listening that it would be gone. It was gone. The walls were bare, clean. It had all been in my head. What was wrong with me? Slowly, dragging my eyes over every surface for any lingering trace of the black markings, I pulled myself towards the flight deck and the radio transmitter. I couldn't do it any longer. I had to call Soyuz. I had to get off this station. If I didn't, I feared the damage would be irreparable, and I would be trapped in this semi-real world of my own hallucinations forever. When I flicked on the radio transmitter, however, something was already being transmitted on the other side. The green lights flickered in confirmation that the set was powered up, and as soon as they did, I tore up the mouthpiece. Before I could speak, however, a harsh, unfamiliar voice jumped from the speakers. Having visual and auditory hallucinations, along with paranoia and loss of appetite, it was Zudov. His voice, usually a source of some comfort despite my recent misgivings, now sent a jolt of pure dread through me. His words, on the other hand, were troubling, to say the very least. They clearly weren't directed at me. Who was he talking to? They hadn't informed me that communication with ground control had been resumed, and I'd told the commander specifically to do that if it was. Keep observing him. Another voice now. Not Zudov, and definitely not flight engineer Rozhdestvensky's dry rasp. If they were the only two people on Soyuz 21, then Zudov must be talking to someone elsewhere. Someone on the ground. There was, a hiss of static, and the channel broke up into meaningless beeping. I listened, a cold anger mixing with my fear. I needed to know who they had been talking about, although I had a sinking, sickening feeling I already knew. Air is contaminated. The channel cleared momentarily, and the other man was still speaking. Contaminated? I didn't quite catch the first half of the sentence through the interference, but that one word alone was enough to spook me thoroughly. Yes, Zudov replied, his voice grim. Concentration is up to 21%. Carry on observing, Soyuz. Nothing more. There was a final hiss, and the stranger went silent. The air went dead. I swallowed, the noise sounding deafening in the new, heavy silence. What had I just heard? Who had they been talking about? The obvious answer was just on the tip of my tongue, but I dared not say it. I didn't even dare think it. It was too dangerous, too terrifying to comprehend. I looked down at the radio set and saw something chilling. The frequency dial had been changed. It certainly wasn't me who changed it, I was sure of it. That meant someone or something else was here. That meant it was all real. The writing, the footsteps, the contamination. I closed my eyes, my hand shaking, and turned the dial back to the familiar position, the frequency for Soyuz 21. The warm hiss of static greeted me, different in tone, less charged than that on the other channel. I had to know. I had to know who they were talking about. I had to know whether I was alone up here. I had to know if I was losing my mind, or if something far more sinister was at play. Soyuz 21? Come in, Soyuz 21, I asked eventually, my eyes still clamped firmly shut as if not seeing the radio panel would somehow change the reality of what I'd heard. Reading Ops 3. Reading loud and clear. Zudov's voice, back to its usual calm, professional tone. 2. Calm. Soyuz. I began, then stopped to take a deep, steadying breath. Soyuz, have you had any communication with ground control yet? My voice was carefully neutral. There was a short, heavy pause before Commander Zudov spoke. When he did, I could almost hear the sickeningly false smile on his lips. None whatsoever, I'm afraid, Salyut. Still out because of these damned solar flares. That was it. The big lie. The tipping point. As soon as those words reached me, I nearly broke down in despair. A little sob escaped my mouth, a tiny, pathetic sound. The man I had trusted all this time. Had everything been lies? Every reassurance, every word of encouragement? Ops 3, do you copy? He asked eventually, his voice still smooth, still patient. I tried to bring myself to respond. Am I alone up here, Commander? My voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible above the interference. Alone? What do you mean, Boris? The use of my first name again, that false intimacy. I mean, is there someone else on the station? There's no one up here but you, Boris. Only you. His voice was gentle, soothing, dangerous. You're saying it's all in my head? You're saying I've lost my mind? Of course not. You're just under a lot of stress, all alone up there. It's no surprise you began to see things, hear things. It was only to be expected from someone in your conditions. I know I'm not crazy, I insisted, though a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced through my conviction. Of course you're not crazy, he purred gently, his voice warm and reassuring. I was almost lulled back into trusting the man again. Almost. You're just tired, he interrupted smoothly. You've worked hard, but don't worry. Your mission is nearly over. I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow, I repeated numbly. One more day. I wasn't crazy. It wasn't all in my head. That man, that voice was lying to me. It had to be real. But what could I do? He would be here in less than a day, and after that, things would be far, far out of my hands. Chapter 11. The walls have ears. I tore open every cupboard, looked through every compartment, scoured every inch of the plain white metal of the station's interior. I searched for any slightest inclination, any hint that there might be a concealed compartment somewhere, a hidden access panel, anything. I looked for anything that could prove me right, prove that Zudov was lying, prove that I wasn't alone and I wasn't insane. There was nothing. I don't know how much time passed in my frantic, desperate search, but soon I realized looking was a fool's errand. There was nothing to find, or perhaps I was looking for the wrong thing. What if it isn't human? I spoke out loud, the sound of my own voice shocking me in the cramped, silent air of the station. I never talked to myself. My voice was small and insignificant, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The idea once voiced haunted me. I had never believed in the paranormal and things beyond scientific explanation, but my heart beat faster just thinking about it. There was clearly an entity of some kind up here with me, and if it wasn't a man, then came the rasping. A deep, wet hiss from within the walls. It was followed by another, this one sounding more like a gasp. I froze, every muscle tensed as I listened, the regular rhythmic inhaling and exhaling of air. Slow, deliberate. Something was breathing. Something inside the walls. Commander? I whispered into the radio, my head jerking around as I heard another breath, louder this time. It was only just audible when I was at the radio set. It seemed to emanate from the living area bulkhead, the wall separating us from the cold vacuum. I can hear it breathe. Breathe? The response was swift and, surprisingly from Zudov, nervous. A crack. In his calm facade, I can hear it breathing inside the walls. It's awake. I held out the mouthpiece and pressed down the transmit button, hoping against hope that he would hear it, that he would finally believe me. That's just the ventilation system, he decided after a moment, his voice laced with doubt, though he tried to sound dismissive. You must have ruptured a tube when you were looking for things. I'll take a look when we get there. I let go of the mouthpiece, my hand slick with sweat. I tried to steady my own breathing, but the great deep breaths coming from the living area bulkhead distracted me from my rhythm, mocking my fear. It couldn't just be a torn air pipe. It had to be something more. Something alive. Slowly, I pulled myself up and began to head slowly, gingerly towards the source of the noise. The knife was still in the kitchen drawer where I'd left it. I withdrew it, its cold plastic handle a small, inadequate comfort, and swung around to face the bulkhead. The noise was coming from within a maintenance panel. I pressed my ear against it, trying to hear what was within. The metal was cold, vibrating faintly against my skin. Thump. There was a loud bang from within, directly behind the panel. I withdrew my head instantly, a choked gasp escaping me. It was followed by a desperate, frantic scratching. Fingernails on metal. A sound that clawed its way into my very soul. I pushed myself backwards, scrambling away, and crashed into the wall behind me, the knife clattering uselessly to the floor. The scratching must have gone on for hours, though it was probably only minutes. I sat there, huddled against the opposite wall in sheer, unadulterated terror, the forgotten knife lying a few feet away. Eventually, the horrifying sound began to slow, the frantic energy waning, and then it stopped. Just silence remained. A silence pregnant with unseen horrors. I slowly unfurled, tears streaming down my face, my body trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't do it anymore. I just couldn't. Ops 3, come in. We are beginning our approach. Zudov's voice cutting through the silence like a blade. I swore loudly and viciously, tears running into my mouth, tasting of salt and despair. Not him. Not now. I was stuck between whatever horror was on the station or whatever horror was on its way. Fuck you, Zudov. I snatched the mouthpiece, my voice a raw yell of pure, cornered fear. Say again, Ops 3? He sounded indignant, offended. Stay away from me, I warned, my voice shaky, cracking. All the while, the hairs on the back of my neck were beginning to stand upright, a primal warning. Don't bring that ship anywhere near. Here. These are my orders, Commander Volinov. His voice was cold now, devoid of any pretense of concern. This was the real Zudov. I have a knife, I threatened, the words tasting like ash in my mouth, knowing my options were running out, knowing how pathetic it sounded. He had forced my hand. There was silence for a second. Time passed by like thick, black, suffocating tar. Is that a threat, Commander Volinov? Zudov was cold in his outrage, but beneath it I could hear strains of pure, controlled ferocity in his voice. Did you just threaten me? Stay away from me, I sobbed once again, the fight draining out of me. Please. I'm so sorry, Boris, he said, his voice once again smooth, almost gentle. And then the frequency went dead. Chapter 12. The Devil's Cosmonaut. I could see it. A tiny black dot against the brilliant, glowing blue curve of the Earth. The Soyuz capsule, silhouetted, growing steadily larger. I had maybe half an hour before he got here. It wasn't enough time. I couldn't think anymore. My mind was a shattered wreck. The thing in the walls was still silent again as far as I could tell. With a heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, I turned back to the maintenance panel where the noise had been coming from. I jumped out of my skin when it gave a sudden, piercing screech, followed by another. It was the sound of nails on a chalkboard amplified 100 times, a sound designed to shred sanity. Staring at the panel, transfixed by horror, I saw a sight I will never forget, a sight that will be burned into my retinas for whatever remains of my life. The screech was coming from a screw, one of the panel's retaining screws. It was turning in its socket, slowly, deliberately, giving a mighty tortured squeal with each fractional rotation. There was a faint clink as the screw finished its last rotation and floated gently away from its holding, tumbling slowly in the microgravity. Whatever was turning the screws from the inside moved onto the second one, then the third. I backed up slowly, step by agonizing step, and clutched the knife I'd retrieved so hard my knuckles were white. My tears were in streams down my face, leaving salty deposits on my eyelids that stung. I gritted my teeth. It felt like the contents of my stomach were about to rush up my throat, hot and acidic. It was heavy and nauseating. Another sob racked my quivering body. I crawled into the airlock hatch entrance right next to the dark, dried stain of Zholobov's blood. I ran my fingers over the rough patch and closed my eyes. In my head, I tried to drown out the sounds of the unscrewing panel, the impending arrival of Zudov with desperate, incoherent prayers, but it wasn't enough. The screeches continued, methodical, relentless. There was a heavy clunk as I felt the Soyuz impact the docking port. Docking. Cracking open one eye, I looked back into the station. Floating in the air was the now detached maintenance compartment panel, along with a handful of tiny, glinting screws. I heard movement from within the dark opening. A rustling. A soft, wet sound. Turning my focus back to the Soyuz, I banged on the airlock door. A frantic, desperate rhythm. Then I felt the familiar hiss as the seals between the station and the capsule began to equalize, air rushing to fill the narrow passage. This was it. The hairs on the back of my neck were pricking up again, standing on end. I had to get out. I had to get out now. The airlock hatch hissed, a final sighing release, and swung open. My eyes fell into the Soyuz capsule, into the tiny, cramped space where the two cosmonauts would be, where the man I had been talking to for the last week, the man who was either my savior or my tormentor, would be sitting. The capsule was empty.